What is going on YouTube? No, it's been a little while since I did a video last, but I wanted to come back. This is news that usually I'll try to peel off some time to make a video for, and hopefully got a little bit more talk coming ahead with what is sure to be a busy off season. One of my favorite things to talk about in college football now, it's just the transfer portal. Really opens things up to a new age in college football. I mean, obviously, people have talked about this like free agency. And we're going to continue to see that development in the years ahead. But I wanted to talk about today the commitment of Quinn Ewers from Southlake Carroll High School to the Texas Longhorns. I cover Texas, and so this is something that is a topic that is closer to me, but it's also something that will shift, I think, the way a lot of people look at college football. This Quinn Ewers situation, he goes from Ohio State to Texas, actually kind of Texas to Ohio State, then back to Texas. He was originally a Texas commit under Tom Herman before kind of flipping to Ohio State, even though he decommitted from Texas, then went to Ohio State a couple months later. But, it's really something that I think is going to, among other things, change the nature of how college football is viewed. What Quinn Ewers did by reclassifying from the 2022 recruiting class to 2021 and enrolling at Ohio State this fall, was something that, sure, you've seen high school prospects do that before in football and basketball, but I'm thinking more like Anthony Edwards at Georgia. But it's something that you don't see a whole lot, and especially not with someone that's that big of a, or that big or that large caliber, I can't talk right now, of commitment and of a prospect. Quinn Ewers is one of the only, I think, one of 6 or 7, maybe 8 or 9. So it's a low number of perfect 247 sports composite prospects coming out of high school. And he is, if you watch his film, one of the most talented quarterbacks that I've seen in the past decade or two. But anyway, so I do want to talk on kind of the impact that this has on Texas, the impact that it has on the transfer portal as a whole, and then kind of what this means for the Big 12, the SEC, the Longhorns, college football as a whole moving forward. So we can start on the impact with Texas first and foremost, because I know Longhorns fans are going to be really excited about this, and rightly so. He's a big addition to the program. Steve Sarkisian really needed a boost, something getting going on the recruiting trail or coming out of the transfer portal after a really bad 6-game losing streak, a loss to Kansas. You finish up the season 5-7. At one point, you have aspirations of going to the Big 12 championship game, of having a rematch with OU at some point, and having really something that can get some momentum going on the recruiting trail, get some of the bigger in-state prospects that you had on the docket for this 2022 recruiting class. I'm looking like Evan Stewart, Denver Harris. They did just land one in Kelvin Banks, but Devon Campbell, those sorts of guys. And, despite what happened on the field this fall, you can get some of that momentum back on the recruiting trail, and they have already. You got a commitment out of Kelvin Banks this weekend. Cam Williams is a big offensive tackle for them to seal up. Both former Oregon commits, big pieces of this 2022 recruiting class a few days ahead of the early signing period for Texas. We'll see what happens, what other dominoes fall the rest of the way. I've talked about it before, not on here, but just covering Texas on what it could mean for Evan Stewart, maybe Armani Winfield. Those are 2 blue chips, 2 former Texas commits. Evan Stewart committed to now committed to A&M. To be honest, this moves the needle with him, I'm sure. I'm sure it's something that will capture his attention. Is it something that will flip him from A&M at this point? I don't know. I think you're looking at maybe a 10 or 20% chance at best, but I mean, you got to try. You have to try if you're Texas. Armani Winfield, to be honest, I think he wishes he was still committed to Texas. But I can't be speaking for a recruit here, but I'm just thinking if I were him and you just had such a seismic weekend in recruiting for Texas, he was originally bought in. I believe he was Steve Sarkisian's first commit in the 2022 class. And, you kind of start to see things come off the rails, honestly, this fall. And then you get Michigan State, who finds a ton of momentum on the field throughout much of the fall, really make a push. I believe Baylor's making a pretty big push too now for Winfield. And Now that now that there's some real momentum building for Texas, it looks like there would have been a spot for Winfield in this class, in this receiver room. It looks like he's got a decision coming maybe during the early signing period. So we'll see if he pushes it back. That's a good sign for Texas. Obviously he could still land in the 2022 class. I just don't know how realistic that is at this point in time. But if you look beyond Stewart and Winfield, this is probably going to be a pretty massive offseason in terms of skill position talent showing up in the transfer portal. When you have some big time quarterbacks, the Spencer Rattlers of the world, Quinn Ewers, Max Johnson, Dylan Gabriel, all these big time quarterbacks showing up in the transfer portal, you're going to have some big skill position players that might be drawn to go play with them elsewhere. You've also had a lot of coaches that are moving around, and that will always draw some players that want to go elsewhere too. And so that's something that can play into Texas's favor, depending on what Sark wants to do with his wide receiver room heading into the offseason. I think he's going to have his choice of who he wants to grab on the roster, some immediate impact guys for next fall. Right now, they have Brennan Thompson, a really speedy 4-star kid out of Spearman in the 2022 class. They're also going after a 3-star kid, a former SMU commit, I believe, Citavion Red. I believe outside of the top 1,000 prospects in the nation for 2022, but it's a kid that can make some things happen in the open field. And actually watching his film, a kid that I personally buy into. I think he's got some potential. That speedy, kind of smaller frame wide receiver that can play out of the slot is something that Sark has shown that he really values in his offensive scheme and can work really well in that system. Xavier Worthy from this season is a good example of that. But I do think that there are going to be some other big names showing up in the transfer portal that Texas can go nab because they've only got one blue chip wide receiver commit in the 2022 class. I don't know who else is really out there right now among blue chips that they're prioritizing. Evan Stewart, again, I think they're really going to push for. Shaz Preston, a 4-star kid out of Louisiana, is really good, but I think he's going to end up either Alabama at LSU. I don't think he'll be going to Texas. Anyway, but Texas has a pretty good top group of wide receivers right now. If Troy O'Meary can stay healthy next year, you've got a top 4 featuring nothing else, Brennan Thompson, Troy O'Meary, Jordan Whittington, Xavier Worthy. That's definitely nothing to scoff at. And if Ewers can play just even slightly more consistent football than Texas got out of the combination of Hudson Card and Casey Thompson this season, Texas is going to win at a minimum 1 or 2 more games. And that's a really, I think that's a kind of a pessimistic view. If Quinn Ewers can come out and, be a difference maker right away in spring ball, show that he can be a good fit in this system and really elevate the talent around him. I think that Texas has a really high ceiling on offense behind the Sark system next year. That goes without saying, but especially when you have Bijan Robinson in the backfield, you have an offensive line that looks like it will be much better. But Xavier Worthy just had a very, very close to 1,000-yard season, I believe a dozen touchdowns. With a revolving door quarterback, a mess of an offensive line, very little help once Jordan Whittington went down for a good portion of the season. A lot of attention was on him, but he was one of the breakthrough wide receivers of the 2021 season. And now you got Quinn Ewers that can be throwing the ball his way. Jordan Whittington, also a guy that if he can finally stay healthy, is definitely a threat to be maybe like an 800 or 1,000-yard wide receiver at the least. He's definitely got the talent, the speed, the explosiveness for that. He's just never been able to stay healthy for a full season. And then again, Brennan Thompson, very speedy wide receiver that I think is going to be a big play threat for Texas. One of those guys that Sark is going to love to scheme to get it in the open field, room to run. I think he's going to be huge with this team. But if O'Meary can ever stay healthy, he's going to be a solid piece on the outside as well. Also, Texas moving into the early signing period, I believe there are 23 commits in the 2022 class now. I know that they want to get somewhere around 27 to 30, depending on what they want to do in the transfer portal. There have been Longhorns players showing up in the transfer portal in droves in the last few weeks, most recently safeties BJ Foster and Chris Adamora. But there's they're going to have a lot of scholarship slots open. And I think there's going to be more activity in the transfer portal now once the signing period's done, once Texas has a better idea of what they're looking at in the 2022 class. And then once you get another kind of, I think you're going to be facing another wave of entrance into the transfer portal. There's already been a lot in the last few weeks, but you're probably going to be facing another one during and after bowl season, as well as around the time of spring camp. So I think you're going to face a real more focus point for Texas in the transfer portal once the signing period is over later this week. It begins on December 15th, I believe, wraps up on Friday the 17th. Once Texas has their initial wave of early signees, they know who the early enrollees are going to be. They can then move on to focus on, what their priorities are going to be in the transfer portal, and wide receiver is definitely going to be one of those. Okay, so Texas is obviously going to move, like this addition is going to move the needle for them. Quinn Ewers is going to be someone that, right away, I don't know how many wins it has, but Sark set a pretty low bar. There's no doubt about that. No doubting that. Sark set a low bar this fall. Knowing what he has coming in, barring the minimum for I had a tweet about this earlier. Yeah, Texas at a minimum is looking at an offense at the skill positions that's got Quinn Ewers. You still have Malik Murphy, Casey Thompson. Don't know what's going to happen with Hudson Card. That's an entire another video I could talk about. Who knows what's going to happen in the quarterback room? But assuming Quinn Ewers can take hold of the starting job, this is a skill position group that's also going to feature Bijan Robinson, Roshan Johnson, Keelan Robinson in the running back room, Jonathan Brooks. You got Jaden Blue committed in the 2022 class. I don't want to speak too early on Terrence Gibbs, a 4-star kid, former Florida commit, but someone that seems to have some traction with Texas lately. Could also be part of this running back room, just littered with blue chips, really talented. A lot of NFL caliber talent in this running back room. And a potential Heisman contender next year in Bijan Robinson. Wide receiver room, I've mentioned already a lot. Thompson, O'Meary, Whittington, Worthy. We'll see what else Texas can bring in the 2022 class. At tight end, you got Jared Wiley coming back. We'll see what happens with Citavion Sanders, a former 5-star kid. I know some Texas fans are going to be wondering what he can do, kind of eagerly awaiting. He didn't get much work this fall, but I believe that will be bound to change once this staff can find the right fit for him schematically and positionally, even though it looks like at the tight end position, but Sanders is, he's a freak of nature athletically and can play on either side of the ball. So we'll see what happens there. So point I'm getting at, Texas set a low bar this fall, next season, I think, without letting the expectations get too wildly out of hand, because Quinn Ewers still taking, I believe, 3 snaps as a college quarterback. But the ceiling's definitely a lot higher for this program now. This is something that really does move the needle. So get into kind of what this means for the transfer portal this year. Quinn Ewers is the biggest entrant so far. It depends on what you mean by that. Spencer Rattler was big news to come down. Eli Ricks was someone that, again, really moves the needle for a lot of programs. Don't know where he's going to end up yet. That former LSU DB, he's obviously NFL talent. Going to be a really, really nice addition for wherever he goes next, whether that be a place like maybe that Alabama is one that comes to mind. I know he wants to end up at a national title contender. USC's come up, but I believe Florida would have been a thought beforehand, but they're not going to be in so much in that position, or at least thought of as a national title contender with Billy Napier heading into the offseason. I would need to read up more on Eli Ricks for me to know more on that topic. But point being that Quinn Ewers doing what he just did, going into the transfer portal, finding a new home from one blue blood to another in the span of basically a week. He entered the transfer portal on December 3rd. Today's December 12th, 9 days in between. You have someone that can draw a 5-star talent like that from one destination to another amid all these coaching changes, amid an early wave of transfer portal movement as is. I think that this is going to be kind of similar to how we saw college hoops this past offseason. I think this is going to be the biggest offseason in the transfer portal around the college football landscape so far. I've heard rumblings of other big-time quarterbacks entering the transfer portal, maybe ones not necessarily of the same recruiting ranking or freshman hype as Quinn Ewers, but some that in terms of proven experience and immediate impact could make a huge difference right away. Dylan Gabriel types, maybe some bigger names there as well. But, the transfer portal, I mentioned this earlier, you're going to have this wave of skill position players. You're going to have quarterbacks that are younger, that are honestly chasing a lot of NIL money that they'll want at other programs they could really only get by, going to a place that will value maybe a little bit more, or, getting these. Texas just put an NIL program in place that's paying offensive or scholarship offensive linemen about $50,000 annually. As other programs start to try to put things like that in place elsewhere, you're going to see that impact recruiting, whether it be out of high school or out of the transfer portal a little bit more. And I think you're going to see younger QBs now, like Quinn Ewers. I think you're going to start seeing a lot more of them in the transfer portal, and maybe going to schools that they dreamed of going to growing up, and maybe just the fit wasn't right at the time, or they didn't have the right coaching staff in place, whatever that be. I think you're going to see a lot more of that starting this offseason. I think Quinn Ewers will lead a wave in that sense. And again, you're going to get skill position, offensive linemen, that sort of talent following into the transfer portal as well, which will add to this wave, the importance of the portal in the offseason. Now, I said I also wanted to touch on where Texas, what happens with the transfer portal, what happens from here. For Texas, the immediate focus is the early signing period, signing day coming up starting December 15th. They already locked into big-time commitments this weekend. I mentioned them, Cam Williams, Kelvin Banks, 2 offensive linemen. They're going to try to close on Devon Campbell. I believe that would be the biggest priority right now. You got 5-star corner Denver Harris. Mentioned him earlier. I don't know how much a defensive player is going to be drawn to Texas right now, or how much the commitment of viewers will change things compared to someone like a Devon Campbell, or maybe even like an Evan Stewart. But I think that this definitely helps for someone like Denver Harris. But Texas has a few 5-star commits they're zoning in on. You got Harold Perkins, again, another 5-star defensive player that is deciding, I believe, January 2nd. This probably does nothing but good things for Texas in his eyes. You get this wave of momentum with Texas right now. I think there's a few other guys to watch too. Malik Ogbo is a guy that I think is going to end up at Texas, a 4-star offensive lineman. Cam Dewberry, a 4-star offensive lineman that is probably going to take Texas a little bit. I mean, Texas was probably already, right now, I believe they're his number 2 behind A&M. There's so many guys right now that I could be talking about in this respect, though. So I think there's a lot of guys that Texas was maybe a number 2 with, or they were in the mix, but not necessarily a favorite, that will move the needle with them too. Often these type of blue chip offensive prospects in the 2022 class that will be drawn to playing with Quinn Ewers. So that's the immediate focus. I think Texas at a minimum is going to be trying to add 5, maybe 6 pieces out of the transfer portal this offseason. They can come in and be, if not starters right away, challenge for starting roles. They've already lost a lot of starters to the transfer portal or to the NFL draft that they could have returned. Looking at places like the safety. You lose BJ Foster. Chris Adamore wasn't the starter, but he'd taken significant reps over the last 2 years. You lost major turnover at the linebacker position. You lost Josh Thompson at corner, and that's just on defense. The offensive line, similar deal. You lost Joshua Moore, wide receiver. Running back's pretty much covered, but I think everything else on offense is pretty wide open. See if they want to add a tight end too. Jared Wiley coming back, but I mean, if you could go out and add like an Austin Stogner for you, I think that would be a little bit more helpful. But yeah, so I think those are the next 2 focuses for Texas. Spring ball is going to be fun, seeing how Quinn Ewers can throw the ball around to all of the new skill position talent that he'll have around him. Now, the transfer portal as a whole, I think that's the other big thing to talk about here. I mentioned it earlier. I do think that this is the first of 3 or 4 potentially big waves that you'll see in the movement in the transfer portal. You've always seen one for the past three or so years. There's always going to be a big wave in the transfer portal once bowl season concludes. And throughout the next month, you're going to see a big, just steadily big wave. I think that also you're going to see, I think you're going to see a big wave maybe after spring ball, around spring camp for sure. Is depth charts for spring start to take shape, but you're going to see a big movement then. Definitely after spring ball, as guys start to figure out where they're fitting more often. But around the time of summer workouts, you're still going to have a last group of kind of major transfer portal entrants that can still take a few visits during the off season and really find the right spot for them. but that might be the last wave that you really see. You're going to see 3 or 4 major waves as transfer portal entrants, and that's just going to be the dominating storyline of the offseason, I think. The early signing period is going to be a massive one. That still matters a ton, but like I said, very similar to college hoops. I think you're going to see a massive, massive movement of talent in the transfer portal this offseason, largely thanks to what guys like a Quinn Ewers, kind of like a Spencer Rattler, but like Dylan Gabriel, these guys that are putting their names, these big-time quarterbacks, just big-time talents, putting their names in the transfer portal pretty early on before the offseason even hits. I think that's going to add to the fuel of all of these players having the confidence to go elsewhere, maybe find a better fit schematically, find where they can really get in a place to push for the NFL and get a place where the NIL money is going to really be a draw to them. I think that is going to be the other biggest takeaway. I don't know what other big names we're going to be seeing showing up in the transfer portal per se, but I think Quinn Ewers is going to be the biggest name that shows up in the transfer portal this offseason. Maybe, probably not. I just think we're going to see some real big stars or difference makers show up that are going to be highly sought after. And I mentioned it before, but I think this is going to be the biggest offseason in the transfer portal to date. Don't know what it's going to look like in the future, but NIL money coming about is going to even further push this transfer portal thing to look more like a version of college football free agency. Anyway, that is pretty much it. Like I said, a lot of angles to cover for the Quinn Ewers transfer from Ohio State to Texas in terms of its implications for the Longhorns, the recruiting trail, the transfer portal, the college sports landscape as a whole, kind of how all this is playing out so early on, not even at the point of college football's offseason yet. We're still about a month away from that. Anyway, that's pretty much it. Let me know what y'all think about this transfer. I'm sure if you're not a Texas fan, not a whole lot of good to say about it or a whole lot of jokes. I've been hearing that. I know a lot, but definitely want to hear what y'all are thinking about because, like I said, I think this thing does have major implications of what's to come for the college football landscape. Anyway, that's pretty much it. See ya.